Joe Walsh is 77 years old, still walking onto one of the most demanding stages in the world, and the man who once couldn't remember which city he'd flown into is now the most controlled person in the room. That alone should stop you. Not because it's a feel-good recovery story, not because the Eagles are selling out the Sphere in Las Vegas, but because what's happening around Joe Walsh right now involves a loss so personal it has quietly reshuffled everything. A band navigating its final chapter without all the people who built it, and one man who has somehow outlasted almost every force that tried to destroy him, including himself. The death of Richard "Smokey" Wendell hit Joe Walsh in a way that the public almost missed entirely. 30 years. That's how long Smokey had been beside him, not as a manager in the traditional sense, not as a publicist or a handler, but as the person who physically rebuilt Joe Walsh's daily life when it was coming apart at the seams. When Walsh stood on the Sphere stage in Las Vegas and dedicated an entire show to Smokey, there were no elaborate speeches, no choreographed tributes, no lighting rigs programmed for emotional effect. Just Walsh at the microphone saying, "Tonight is for my friend who gave me a second chance in life." And then the guitars came in, and images of the two of them appeared in the light, and that was it. Rolling Stone called it the most honest moment of his career, and that's a career that spans more than 50 years and includes some of the most dishonest, chaotic, and self-destructive behavior the rock world has ever witnessed up close. To understand why Smokey's death carries this weight, you have to go back to what Walsh was before Smokey arrived. And what he was, plainly stated, was a man in free fall. The drinking started early and accelerated hard through the peak touring years. Cocaine became a regular fixture on the road, and the combination of both produced a version of Joe Walsh that his own colleagues described as continuous self-destruction. He wasn't just partying, he was disappearing. There was a car accident that left his girlfriend seriously injured. There were financial collapses, emotional shutdowns, and a period where he could not track his own movements from city to city. On a trip to Paris, he woke up in a hotel room holding a photocopy of his passport because the original was gone, and he had no clear memory of how he'd arrived or what city he was even supposed to be in. His inner circle watched this unfold and eventually decided that something structural had to change, not an intervention in the theatrical sense, but a complete reorganization of his environment. Smokey Wendell was brought in as part of that restructuring, and his official role was to keep Walsh away from substances. What actually developed between them went far beyond that job description. Smokey became the steady architecture of Walsh's daily life, the person who understood where the edges were and made sure Walsh didn't walk off them again. One of the early steps was getting Walsh out of familiar environments entirely, including an extended trip to New Zealand where, by Walsh's own account, he experienced his first real stretch of sobriety in years. He didn't elaborate on the specifics, but the fact that he remembers it clearly is itself the point. He could remember it. That was new. When Walsh returned, he began attending support group meetings and committed to a substance-free life in a way he hadn't managed before. What separated his recovery from many others in the music industry was his decision to make it visible. He put it plainly in one interview, "The whole world saw me destroy myself, so they should see me recover." That's not a PR move. That's a man who understood that transparency was part of the work. He cut ties with relationships that posed a risk, built new ones with fellow recoverers, and formed a close friendship with Ringo Starr, another musician who had walked through serious addiction and come out the other side. Each sober day became its own kind of proof, stacked one on top of another over decades. Walsh went further than personal recovery. He co-founded Facing Addiction, an organization built on the practical reality that addiction is a public health issue and not a private moral failure. His involvement wasn't ceremonial. He showed up, he talked, and he stayed engaged with the work over many years. Those who worked with him understood that he operated on a zero-tolerance basis when it came to relapse, and in an industry where temptation is essentially built into the schedule, maintaining that standard required a support system that Smokey Wendell anchored for 30 years. Now that anchor is gone, and Walsh is navigating the absence in the only way that seems to make sense to him, by continuing to perform, by letting the music absorb what words can't hold. Before any of this, before the recovery and the advocacy and the tribute at the Sphere, Walsh had already changed the Eagles in ways that couldn't be undone. When he joined the band, the Eagles were known for polished country rock, a sound that Don Henley and Glenn Frey had carefully built, and that was selling well. Walsh was something different entirely. His playing was louder, rawer, built on strong riffs and a kind of reckless technical confidence that the existing lineup didn't have. Don Henley and Glenn Frey had wanted to move toward a heavier sound, and Walsh was the instrument of that shift. What came after his arrival included some of the most enduring recordings in American rock history, among them Hotel California, where his guitar solo has spent nearly 5 decades being described as one of the finest in the genre, and Life in the Fast Lane, which carried his stamp from the opening note. The tension inside the Eagles during those years was real and ongoing. Walsh was not the primary songwriter behind the band's most recognized material, and that gap between creative contribution and public credit created friction that never fully resolved. Add to that the relentless pace of touring and recording, the near-total absence of downtime, and the personality conflicts that develop when talented and strong-willed people are locked into close professional proximity for years, and the result was a band that eventually announced a prolonged hiatus because its members simply couldn't sustain the internal pressure. The reunion that followed brought the Eagles back to stages around the world, but the atmosphere was never entirely easy. Walsh's role during that period was to perform at the highest level, regardless of what was happening off stage, and by then, sober and disciplined, that's exactly what he delivered every night. By 2025, the Eagles had committed to a residency at the Sphere in Las Vegas, and the Sphere is not a forgiving environment for habits built over 50 years of live performance. The technology demands precision. The sound system is calibrated to a degree that leaves no room for the kind of spontaneous improvisation that Walsh built his reputation on. He admitted openly that the adjustment was uncomfortable, that the setup felt too controlled, too locked in. But he adapted, and the adaptation produced something unexpected. A version of Walsh's playing that retained its rock weight while becoming more structured and intentional than anything he'd done before. Longtime followers noticed the shift. What had once been the wild card of the Eagles' live show was now its most reliable element. That shift happened against a backdrop of personnel changes that put more on Walsh's shoulders. Guitarist Stuart Smith stepped back from the lineup due to health concerns, and Walsh absorbed more of the musical responsibilities in the shows that followed. At 77, carrying a heavier load on one of the most technically demanding stages ever built, he's not slowing down by any outward measure. But the signs of a man quietly preparing for a final chapter are there if you look at the full picture rather than just the set list. Walsh's personal life has always been the part of the story that gets the least attention relative to its actual weight. 3 marriages, children from earlier relationships that he acknowledges growing distant from during his worst years, and the death of a young daughter from illness that he has spoken about only rarely and never at length. He admitted in one of the few times he addressed it that his early inability to maintain stability hurt the people closest to him, not through dramatic betrayals but through absence and dysfunction and a lifestyle that left nothing for anyone else. The distance between him and his children from those years was one he worked to reduce after getting sober. But time lost to addiction doesn't come back, and Walsh has been honest about the fact that some of what was damaged couldn't be fully repaired. Meeting Marjorie Bach changed the shape of his personal life in a way that none of his earlier relationships had. The introduction came through Ringo Starr, and the connection that developed led to a marriage that has held through the years since. Marjorie is not a background figure in Walsh's recovery story. She has been a direct participant in the community work, standing beside him in campaigns aimed at helping people navigate addiction. Since the marriage, Walsh has structured his schedule deliberately to limit exposure to environments that carry risk, reducing touring commitments in ways that would have been unthinkable during the Eagles' peak years. The private life he's built with Marjorie operates on a different set of rules than the one he maintained for decades on the road, and he's been clear that this separation between public performance and private stability is something he guards carefully. The event that reveals most about where Walsh stands right now is VET 2025, a music festival he's organized in Wichita, the city where he was born. It's built around fundraising for veterans, and it will be the first time he has brought this kind of event back to his hometown. Walsh has said that returning to where he started is the right way to close a circle in his life. He hasn't described it as a farewell. He hasn't used that word. But the people who have been paying attention understand that bringing music back to Wichita, dedicating a show at the Sphere to the man who kept him alive, carrying more of the Eagles' weight as the band moves through what may be its final major run, none of this reads like a man who expects to continue indefinitely. It reads like a man who is choosing how to end something with intention and on his own terms. Walsh has not announced a retirement. He's given no timeline and made no formal statement about what comes next. But the picture that emerges from everything he's done in the past year points in a clear direction. A loss that shook his foundation. A stage commitment that has demanded more from him than any previous one. A hometown event that carries the symbolic weight of a closing chapter. And through all of it, not a single grand declaration, not a tearful press conference, not a biographical documentary framing his legacy in past tense. Just Walsh, still on stage, still playing, letting the music say what he hasn't. That's the thing about someone who spent years unable to form a coherent memory of his own life, and then built 30 years of clear-eyed, disciplined sobriety on top of the wreckage. He knows what silence costs and what it's worth. He lost the person who helped him build that silence, and his response was to walk out under the lights at the Sphere and dedicate a show to him. No ceremony, no grand gesture, just the music and the guitars and the images of two people who made something possible together. Joe Walsh is still here, and for now, that remains the most complete sentence available.